Hello, welcome to another video. Today we are going to paint a beautiful lake landscape with watercolor. In last week's video I explained how to mix pastel watercolors using white watercolor. I recommend you check out that video as well. I will leave the link in the top corner for you. Pastel colors work perfect for today's painting, but if you don't have any, you can definitely paint this landscape without using white watercolors as well. Regardless, you should always test, pick and wetten your watercolors in advance, as you have to work quickly when using the wet and wet method. I prepared two different blues and one pinkish color for the background. All three colors are mixed from blue and magenta only, and I'm using white watercolor to turn them into pastel colors. To mix the darker blue, I added a hint of magenta to it to darken it. Adding a color that is contrasting on the color wheel will simply darken the watercolor. The painting will look more cohesive when you don't introduce a new blue color, but mix a darker one instead. To paint the background, I pre-wetten the paper and then start to drop in watercolor. Elements that are further away are out of focus. The wet watercolor added to the wet paper will bleed out, causing fuzzy edges. To intensify the effect, the mountains that are even further away are painted with a lighter blue watercolor mix. The mountains in the front are painted with a darker watercolor mix. You can add some dimension to the mountains by suggesting shadows. I simply add more or darker watercolor to those areas that are in the shadow. I paint back to front, as the mountains in the front overlap the mountains in the back. Don't worry about the pencil lines, I can erase them later with a hard eraser, as I only cover them with a very light wash. The pencil lines also look darker in the video than they actually are. How far your watercolor can bleed depends on how dry the paper is, which depends on what type of paper you're using. When the paper is drier, the watercolor does not bleed out as far and is more concentrated and darker in the areas where I originally added it to the paper. You can utilize this knowledge in your painting and go back in and add darker colors. When painting the trees, I paint them as I normally would on dry paper. Here the paper is moist, so I'm letting the watercolor bleed out a little to make them appear out of focus. It is important to know how wet the paper is in order to control how far they can bleed. Evergreens are painted by dabbing the brush on the paper to create little dots that barely touch. They have the outer shape of a triangle, like the overall evergreen has the outer shape of a triangle. If you want to know more about painting trees, I linked other videos for you on the top corner where I explain that in detail. To add some more dimension to the mountains, I'm lifting some paint with a dried off brush just to make the Rocky Mountains look more interesting and give it more structure. Let's move on and paint the lake. In the water, you can see the reflection of the mountains, but due to the waves, the mountains are out of focus. I like to start with the lighter color here, then move on to the blue colors. Adding the pinkish color first will help me control how far the blue will bleed. Plus, I tend to add too much of the darker colors, so adding the pink first helps me with that. And don't forget to use the white paper here. Using it as if it was a color will help you to keep the colors very light. The water reflects more of the sky than you can see above the mountains. This is my chance to make the sky even more dramatic. I take my time to paint the water and literally watch the paint dry. As I mentioned before in this video, the drier the paper, the less the color bleeds. This effect is amazing to use for this type of painting. When you use this effect, you really need to know your paper and understand when to stop painting and adding watercolor. If your paper dries too fast, you might have to take a break, let it dry and add another layer. I add a very light peach color to the reflection of the sky to make the painting more dramatic. I mix it from cadmium yellow and ochre rose. This is not mandatory, but if you want to know more about how to mix it, watch last week's video. At this point in the painting process, take into consideration how wet your brush is. When the paper is drying, but still okay to be worked with, and you release a giant amount of water with your brush onto it, it will cause blooms. Before I continue, I wait a few minutes until the painting is dry to the touch. Watercolor always looks lighter once it dried. This is why I add a second layer of watercolor to some areas, just to intensify the colors. I pre-wetten the paper and then add the color. Remember to always wetten an area which is wider than the area that you intend to paint, as you can leave watermarks if you don't. Once the second layer is dry, I can make some corrections. I'm using a designated moist brush to re-wetten some of the paper and soften hard edges and waterlines. After reactivating the pigment on the paper, I can also soak it up with a paper towel. Remember that watercolor can stain the paper, and depending on the brand of paper, it is soaked up in the paper and cannot be removed. Once the paper dried from the corrections, I can re-wetten areas and add yet more watercolor to intensify some colors. The painting should really come together now. To be honest, sometime around now I stop looking at the reference photo and look at the painting. This makes it easier to see where to add color to complete the reflection. Following the reference photo too close can sometimes cause the painting to look unrealistic or just somehow off. Touching the misty mountains, on the other hand, would be a mistake, as the evergreens would lose detail. When pre-wettening the lake, I can unintentionally lift paint or soften soft edges even more. I'm not willing to take the risk for the mountains. Note that the pink I add up here is very light and lets the blue shine through. This difference in technique keeps the painting interesting. The painting is dry, so let's mix and test the colors for the boats. The boats are in reality probably painted in a solid red color, but there are shadows in the reference picture. I use red watercolor and add a little bit of blue to it. This will darken the red. The more blue I add, the darker the color gets until it turns blackish and then bluish. This is because blue is on the opposite side of the color wheel from red. The circle closes as I only introduced one new color to keep the painting cohesive. The red boats will stand out as I want them to. And you may have guessed, I did the color testing before I started painting. It just fits in the video better in this spot. I paint the boat in layers. I start with an underpainting in red only and add darker colors after it dried. This will ensure that the red color shines through. Painting the reflection of the boats requires me to know how fast the paper dries, and I need to add the watercolor at the perfect time. I want fuzzy edges, but no white bleeding. I also have another brush ready to soak up any red watercolor which bleeds out too far. I will use my brush like a sponge for that. While the paper is still wet, I add more red watercolor or even some dark red watercolor to the boats, not the reflections. As there are hard edges on the boats, I can do this with confidence. I need to watch the bleeds from the reflections like a hawk. In order to create truly soft shadows here, the light red reflection will reach out a little further than the darker one I will add in the next layer. When the watercolor is dry to the touch, I can add the next layer of red watercolor. I mix some of the blue to the red to darken it and apply to the paper with a small brush. There are lighter areas on the boat which I leave out, and I try to create a gradient of color where needed. I might have to add another layer though. Don't get caught up in too many small details here, like petals. Too many small details would distract the eye. When I tried to correct the outer line of the reflection, my brush was slightly too damp and it caused bleeding of the dark red watercolor pigment. This can happen, and instead of cutting it out of the video, I want to show you my mistake so that you know how to fix it when it happens to you. The most important thing is to not panic and keep correcting it until the paper is dry enough for the watercolor to stop bleeding. Using a paper towel to soak it all up is a possibility, but will most likely cause some of the watercolor to remain in areas where I do not want it, and I'm not confident that I can lift it later as it stains the paper. Also, I would have to wait and give it some drying time, and I'm too impatient. Once the watercolor is dry enough to safely do this, I use a truly only damp and, just as a precaution, a small brush to soften the outer edges of the reflection. I let the boats dry for a bit and then reclaim some of the highlights by lifting pigment. I soften the pigment with a damp brush and then soak it up with a paper towel. As these boats are small, adding dark watercolor to some areas but not to others can be challenging. I like easy solutions, and planning to lift pigment is one of those. Don't be afraid to integrate the process of lifting in your process of painting. Also, some of the edges just did not turn out as sharp as I hoped, so lifting is a good option. Watercolor always dries lighter than it appeared when you first applied it. Let's darken the red even more and add the last details. I stop looking at the reference photo and work only with what I see in front of me. I want to make these boats easily recognizable, and I want to add some dimension to them. I also need to add contrast to the painting, for example by darkening the reflections in the water. Okay, fine, let's re-add the reference picture to this video to make it easier for you to see where we are going. I darken the edges where the boats touch the water, and these areas are in the shadows. Let's add some shadows to the inside of the boats as well. The last detail I want to add is the chain for the anchor. I pre-wetten the lower part of it, which is a reflection on the water, and then I just draw it in one straight line. Let's remove the tape from the final piece and see how it turned out. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon with the next video.